Imagine you are sitting on a resource reserve worth approximately $27 trillion. Oil, natural gas, uranium, copper, zinc, rare earth elements. Almost every resource that the modern economy needs lies beneath your feet. That number is so large that, by comparison, the total value of these resources exceeds the GDP of many major economies in the world. But here is the shocking part. Despite owning such an enormous resource base, the people of that country still have an average income of only a few $1,000s per year. The national currency has lost value dozens of times within a decade. Inflation has remained high for years, and there have even been periods when importing basic medicines became difficult. It sounds like an unbelievable economic paradox. But that is exactly the story of Iran. If you only look at the resource map, Iran should be one of the richest countries in the world. The country possesses the second largest natural gas reserves on the planet and oil reserves ranked among the top globally. Throughout the 20th century, oil was the resource that transformed many Middle Eastern nations into financial powers. But Iran, despite having comparable resources, has not achieved the same economic outcome. So the real question is not whether Iran has resources. The more important question is who controls the value of those resources. In resource economics, there is a concept that is rarely discussed in mainstream financial channels. Natural resources only have value when they can be converted into cash flow within the global economic system. A barrel of oil lying underground has almost no value. It only becomes an asset when it can be extracted, transported, insured, traded, and paid for through the international financial network. In other words, oil is not just a resource. It is an entire economic chain composed of multiple layers: extraction, transportation, finance, insurance, banking, and energy markets. And the country that controls these layers of the system is the one that truly controls the value of the resource. If we look at the history of the global economy, we will see a pattern repeated many times. Countries rich in natural resources are not necessarily wealthy countries. In fact, many economists call this phenomenon the resource curse, when wealth beneath the ground does not translate into wealth within the economy. But in the case of Iran, the story is even more complex. This is not only a story about economic management or domestic policy, it is a story about geopolitics, financial power, and the global energy system that has been built over more than a century. To understand why a country can sit on tens of trillions of dollars in resources yet remain trapped in economic difficulty, we must go back more than 100 years to an oil contract signed at the beginning of the 20th century. A small contract on paper, but one that would later completely change the economic fate of an entire nation. And when you look back at that history, you will realize something very thought-provoking in the global economy. The one who owns the resources is not always the one who holds the power. And it is precisely the story that began more than a century ago that helps explain why. Part 1. When resources do not belong to their owner. If we want to understand why Iran can sit on tens of trillions of dollars in resources yet still not control their value, we must go back to a moment that seems very small in economic history. The year 1901. In that year, a British businessman named William Knox Darcy signed a contract with the Persian government, granting him the right to explore and extract oil across nearly 500,000 square miles of territory. To understand the scale of this agreement, that area was larger than France and Germany combined, and the price for it was about 20,000 British pounds, equivalent to a few $1 million in today's value. In return, Persia would receive only 16% of the profits from the extraction activities. A few years later, in 1908, one of the largest oil fields ever discovered at that time was found. From that discovery, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was created, the company that later became the energy giant we know today as BP. Over the next 4 decades, oil from Iran became one of the most important energy sources for the industries of Britain and Europe. But the problem was this: Iran had almost no control over that extraction system. Foreign companies operated the entire chain of production, transportation, and finance. Even when Iranian officials requested access to accounting records to verify their 16% share of profits, they were not allowed to see the financial data. By the early 1950s, an economic paradox had become clear. At that time, Iran was one of the largest oil producers in the Middle East. Yet the Iranian government received less money from oil than the amount of tax revenue the British government collected from the profits of the oil company. In other words, the country that owned the oil was receiving fewer benefits than the country extracting it. That was the moment when Iranian politics began to change. In 1951, a 69-year-old lawyer named Mohammad Mossadegh became the prime minister of Iran with a very simple promise: nationalize the oil industry. Iran's parliament voted almost unanimously to seize extraction rights from the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and bring the oil sector under state control. For the first time in more than half a century, Iran truly controlled the resources beneath its own soil. But the reaction from outside came almost immediately. Britain imposed a blockade on Iranian oil exports, froze Iran's financial assets abroad, and applied strong economic pressure. At the same time, they convinced the United States that Mossadegh's government might lean toward the Soviet Union in the context of the Cold War. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence launched Operation Ajax, supporting a coup that overthrew Mossadegh's government in only a few days. He was arrested and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Afterward, the Shah of Iran was restored to power, and oil contracts were restructured under a consortium of Western companies. Iran now received about 50% of the oil profits more than before, but the financial, technical, and commercial systems remained in the hands of foreign companies. The lesson Iran drew from the events of 1953 was a very bitter economic one. When a country attempts to take full control of its strategic resources, global economic and political power can intervene to preserve the existing structure. That lesson did not disappear over time. For more than 2 decades afterward, the memory of the 1953 coup remained deeply present in Iranian society. And in 1979, that memory became one of the key forces behind an event that would change the entire economic and political structure of the country. A revolution not only intended to change the government, but to eliminate the entire old economic system. Part 2: The War Without Guns, when the financial system becomes a weapon. By the end of the 1970s, Iran had spent more than 2 decades under the rule of the Shah, a pro-Western government established after the coup of 1953. Although the oil industry generated large revenues, many Iranians still felt that their country did not truly control its own economic destiny. That feeling became one of the forces behind one of the most significant political events of the 20th century, the Iranian Revolution of 1979. But when viewed from an economic perspective, this revolution was not only a political or religious event, it was an economic declaration. The new Iranian government quickly implemented a series of systemic decisions nationalizing the oil industry, nationalizing banks, and bringing major industries under state control. Western companies were expelled from Iran. There were no renegotiated contracts, no shared control. The old economic system was almost entirely dismantled. For many Western countries, especially the United States, This was not simply a political shift in the Middle East. It was a direct challenge to the international energy and financial system that had been built after World War II. The first response came quickly. The United States froze approximately $12 billion of Iranian assets in international banks. But more importantly, from that moment onward, a new type of economic weapon began to be used: financial sanctions. Unlike traditional blockades in history, modern sanctions do not require warships or armies. They operate through global financial systems. And the most important system among them is SWIFT. SWIFT, short for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, is a network that connects more than 11,000 banks across more than 200 countries. Whenever a bank in Tokyo transfers money to Frankfurt, or an oil company in the Middle East sells oil to a refinery in Europe, the payment message usually passes through SWIFT. Simply put, SWIFT is the nervous system of the global monetary system. When a country is removed from this system, the economic consequences are enormous. Banks in that country cannot conduct international payments normally. Businesses struggle to import goods. Exporting resources becomes extremely complicated, and the country's currency becomes almost isolated from global financial markets. Iran has experienced this several times. In 2012, Iran was removed from the SWIFT system due to sanctions related to its nuclear program. After the nuclear agreement in 2016, Iran was partially reconnected to the international financial system. But only 2 years later, when the United States withdrew from the agreement, sanctions were reimposed and Iran once again faced restrictions on access to the global payment system. This creates a very unusual economic paradox. Iran still has oil. The oil fields still exist. The engineers and extraction infrastructure are still there. But if the country cannot receive payment through the international banking system, selling oil on the global market becomes extremely difficult. In other words, the resources still exist, but the path that converts those resources into money has been locked. This is the point where many people begin to recognize an important truth about the global economy. Power does not lie only in controlling resources or armies. In the 21st century, power also lies in the ability to control international financial and payment systems. A country may possess trillions of dollars in resources beneath its soil, but if it cannot use the global financial system to trade those resources, their economic value becomes severely limited. And in the gap that Iran leaves in the oil market, an interesting economic question begins to appear if Iran cannot sell its oil. Then who is selling it instead? Part 3, who really benefits when Iran is removed from the oil market when discussing economic sanctions on Iran. Most conversations focus on whether these measures change the behavior of the Iranian government. But if we look at it from a market economics perspective, there is another question that is just as important when oil supply from Iran disappears. Who is filling that gap? The global oil market operates on a very simple principle. Supply and demand must always remain balanced. The world consumes tens of millions of barrels of oil every day. If a major producer suddenly reduces output, the market does not remain still. Another country will increase production to fill that gap. And for many decades, the country that has often done this is Saudi Arabia. Since the end of World War II, Saudi Arabia and the United States have built a strategic relationship based on energy and security. Riyadh maintains large and flexible oil production capacity, while Washington helps ensure security stability in the region. This system helps the global oil market avoid extremely large supply shocks. In that context, whenever Iran's oil exports are restricted by sanctions, a familiar pattern appears. Production from other countries in the region increases. The clearest example occurred after 2018, when the United States reimposed sanctions on Iran. Before that moment, Iran was producing about 3.8 million barrels of oil per day. But within only 2 years, that production fell to below 2 million barrels per day. The gap of nearly 1.8 million barrels of oil per day did not disappear from the market, it was absorbed by other producers, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. If we make a simple calculation using an oil price of about $80 per barrel, that volume of oil represents more than $140 million per day, over a year. That amount reaches tens of billions of dollars in revenue, shifting from market share that Iran once held to other producers. This reveals an important characteristic of the global energy system: markets always find ways to adapt. When one supplier is removed from the game, other suppliers step in. However, the economic story here is not simply about market competition. It is also connected to the structure of power within the global financial and trade system. In the value chain of oil, there are many critical links. Oil tankers must be insured. Shipping contracts must be financed by banks. And transactions must pass through international payment systems. Most of these links exist within the financial network built and controlled by Western countries throughout the 20th century. This creates an interesting reality. Resources may lie beneath the soil of a country, but the path that brings those resources to the global market passes through systems that the country itself does not control. That is why Iran, despite possessing enormous natural resources, still faces difficulties in converting them into real economic power. And when we look more broadly, this story does not belong only to Iran. It reflects a pattern that has existed in the global economy for more than a century. The country that owns the resources is rarely the country that controls the full value of those resources. Real economic power often belongs to the countries that control financial systems, transportation networks, insurance markets, and international payment systems, the gateways through which all resource flows must pass before they become money. But this system is also gradually changing. As major economies begin building alternative financial and payment networks, an important question is emerging in modern economic geopolitics. Can the current structure of global financial power last forever? Or are we entering a new phase of restructuring in the world economic system? After everything we have analyzed, the story of Iran reveals a very important truth in the global economy. Resources are not power. In economics textbooks, we are often taught that countries rich in natural resources will have an advantage in development. But real history often shows the opposite. Resources are only the starting point. Their real value appears only when those resources can move through a chain of systems that includes extraction, transportation, insurance, finance, and international payment. And for more than a century, most of those systems have been built by Western economic powers. That is why a country can sit on tens of trillions of dollars in resources, yet still be unable to convert all of that value into economic power. Not because it lacks oil, engineers, or technology, but because the path that connects its resources to the global market passes through systems that it does not control. This story is not only the story of Iran, it is a typical example of how global economic power actually operates, and as countries like China, Russia, and other emerging economies begin building alternative financial and payment systems. The world may be entering a period of significant change, a period in which global financial power could be redistributed. In today's global economy, what do you think is more important? Owning resources or controlling financial systems? Can an oil-rich country truly be wealthy if it does not control the payment systems and energy markets? Write your opinion in the comment section. I read all the comments and am very curious to know your perspective. And if you want to see more deep economic and financial analyses like this about geopolitics, energy, and the global monetary system, Do not forget to press like on the video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next analysis. Because in the next video, we will talk about an even more controversial question. What would happen if the current global financial system, the system based on the United States dollar, begins to change? And the answer could affect the entire world economy.